and welcome to the third video in this series of lessons in which I'm outlining how and why I like to incorporate a few arpeggios into scale-based solos. And hopefully you have watched the first two videos, so you'll know that so far we've been using a major triad arpeggio with just one fingering pattern, and we've used it when soloing over a major chord, a dominant chord and a minor chord. So I used that particular triad arpeggio for the first two lessons because it's just one finger pattern that repeats on each pair of strings. So it's a very good introduction to using arpeggios without having to learn lots of complicated fingering patterns. Now in this video we'll be looking at arpeggios based around chord shapes, and we'll start with a major triad arpeggio. So here's a C major chord and the root note is on the A string, and I'm using this slightly unconventional fingering because I'm now going to move it up the fretboard, so I'll need to bar all the strings with my first finger to simulate what the nut is doing in the open position. And if we now move that shape up the fretboard, so the root is the A note at the 12th fret of the A string, we now have an A major chord. And this is the chord shape that we'll be basing our major triad arpeggio on. So here's the fingering for this major triad arpeggio pattern, and because it spans across 4 frets, I'd recommend you use one finger per fret. So the A note will be played with the 4th finger at the 12th fret of the A string. The C sharp is played with the 3rd finger at the 11th fret of the D string. E played with the 1st finger at the 9th fret of the G string. A played with the 2nd finger at the 10th fret of the B string. C sharp played at the 9th fret of the top E string with the 1st finger, and E played at the 12th fret of the E string, top E string, with the 4th finger. And as we saw in the previous lesson, when we use arpeggios within a solo, we don't always have to start on the root note. We could start on any note within the arpeggio. So instead of starting on the A note, we could skip it and start on the C sharp. Now there's a very well-known solo which uses this exact arpeggio shape, and that is Mark Knopfler's first solo in Sultans of Swing. And the underlying chords for that part of the solo are D minor, C, B flat and A7. And over the first 3 chords, the D minor, C and B flat, he basically uses a descending line which comes from the D natural minor scale. But then over the A7 chord, he then plays a lick which comes straight out of the major triad that we just looked at. C sharp, E, A, C sharp, E. And when he gets to that E, in anticipation of the A7 chord going back to the D minor, he then bends the E up to an F, because F is one of the notes within the D minor chord, and then as he releases it, he then comes back down a D minor arpeggio. So it's So that's a really good example of how to use a major triad arpeggio within a solo. And here are a few licks based around this major triad arpeggio shape. And I'm playing over a static A major chord. And you'll notice that I end some of the licks by bending a B note, which is not actually in the arpeggio, but I'm bending it up to a C sharp, which is in the arpeggio. And you'll also notice that in some of the licks I'm using chromatic passing notes to bridge the gap between 2 of the notes. So for example, on the top E string we have the notes C sharp and E, and instead of just playing C sharp to E, I might play, so I'm walking chromatically up or down between 2 notes within the arpeggio. like to extend triad arpeggios to include either the major 7th or the flat 7th note, depending on what kind of chord I'm playing over. So let's try extending this major triad arpeggio pattern to a dominant 7 arpeggio by adding in the flat 7th note, which we do with the 4th finger on the G string. And in the previous video, when we played over a dominant chord, we used the flat 7 as a target note because that's the note that gives a 7 chord its characteristic sound. And we'll do the same here. So here are a few licks based around this A7 arpeggio pattern over a static A7 chord. And in some of these licks you'll see that I'm using chromatic passing notes to bridge the gap between two notes within the arpeggio. So hopefully you now have a few major triad and dominant 7 arpeggio licks and ideas to drop into your solos. And as always, please play around with these arpeggio patterns because there are so many potential licks in there. Now, because this lesson focused on major triad and dominant arpeggios based on a root note on the A string, in the next lesson we'll be looking at minor 7 arpeggios, which are also based on an A string root note. I really hope you found this video useful, and if you have, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.